Good morning, friends. Thanks for joining me for another of our Unfolding the Word times together. We're now in Genesis chapter 4, and I want to pick up readings that we started yesterday in the 4th chapter, verse 1. Now Adam knew Eve his wife, and she conceived and bore Cain, saying, I have gotten a man with the help of the Lord. And again she bore his brother Abel. Now Abel was a keeper of sheep, and Cain a worker of the ground. And in the course of time, Cain brought to the Lord an offering of the fruit of the ground, and Abel also brought of the firstborn of his flock and of their fat portions. And the Lord had regard for Abel and his offering, but for Cain and his offering he had no regard. And so Cain was very angry, and his face fell. We've been looking in this 4th chapter at the first family, the first children coming into the world, and the unfolding of sin as it not only was affecting individuals, but now impacting on the family. And as we'll continue in the 4th chapter, seeing it continue to impact on the broader society as well. We talked yesterday about the birth of these first two children. Today I want to pick up on a bridge going from that discussion of their birth to the actual issue of the 4th chapter, which was the way each of them chose to try to approach God. But as a bridge to that, today I want to focus your attention in verses 2 and 3 particularly on some time gaps that we need to remind ourselves about in these verses. What do I mean by that? These verses are making some assumptions to us that if we read them too fast, we lose those assumptions. So let me go over them with you. Number one, there's a time gap that's occurring within verse 2 itself. Notice the verse, and again she bore his brother Abel. Now Abel was a keeper of sheep, and Cain a worker of the ground. Verse 2, as I read it to you, is making an assumption of the reader. Number one, it's assuming that we understand some time has gone by in the midst of verse 2, from the time of the birth of Cain and Abel to the time of their involvement in their respective professions. You see, Cain and Abel didn't begin their professions, their vocations, at birth, because they were subject to the normal developmental demands and processes of life in this world. The only ones who came into this world fully developed, the only ones who came into this world ready to carry out their task at the time they were created were Adam and Eve, who were created not according to the normal processes that God intends, but were created by that miraculous work of God in creating Adam from the dust and creating Eve from his rib. Cain and Abel, coming through the womb, being born into the world as a baby, having to grow, there was a time gap from the time of their birth and their naming to the time where it could be said about them that they were keeper of the sheep and a tiller or a worker of the ground. It took time. During the period of time that was going by in verse 2, clearly Adam and Eve, as part of their parenting responsibilities toward their children, were giving them training in the skills they needed to survive in the midst of the world, the midst of a post-Eden world. And part of that training, of course, would have been some of those practical vocational experiences of knowing how to shepherd the sheep and other livestock, and how to farm, how to grow the crops, and to be able to, from those crops, have provisions for the broader course of the year. Somewhere along the way, Cain and Abel made choices as to what aspect of activity they wanted to concentrate on. Was it going to be a concentration in the area of shepherding? Was it going to be a concentration in the area of farming? When did they make that choice? Not clear here. But certainly they wouldn't have made that choice at 12 years old. So my suggestion is, given sort of the realities of contemporary culture and the realities of human development, they were probably, certainly, through their first 20 years or so before they settled into a professional life, a vocational life that would allow them to be described as either a keeper of the sheep or a worker of the ground. So there's a time gap here in verse 2. God doesn't elaborate on what happened during that time gap. He assumes that we would understand some of that. But I want to point it out to you because I see people read these verses too rapidly and make some fundamental mistakes in doing it. The second time gap actually occurs between the end of verse 2 and the beginning of verse 3. Now, Abel was a keeper of the sheep, Cain a worker of the ground. That's the end of verse 2. In the course of time, Cain brought to the Lord an offering from the fruit of the ground. The time gap we're talking about is a time gap under that category of in the course of time. Now, we'll come back to that in just a moment. Earlier, I mentioned that Adam and Eve certainly had carried out a child training process with Cain and Abel, equipping them to know those basic skills they needed to survive in this world, shepherding, farming, so forth. But it's also clear, at least implied here, that they were carrying out a spiritual training, the kind of training that God continued to command his people throughout history and into the current day and age, as we are commanded to train up our children, to educate them in the nurture of the Lord. They would have been educating Cain and Abel from the earliest years, both by their example that they were setting, but also by their words, about the consequences of sin. Remember, those consequences were so graphic that they entered into the naming of both of those children. They would have educated them about the consequences of sin, and they would have also educated them about how to find forgiveness for sin, how to establish or reestablish a relationship with the God who made them. They would have understood out of that the important role of animal sacrifice for forgiveness of sin, at least temporary covering of sin. The lessons that went into detail in Genesis 3 certainly would have been reproduced in those children. How could Adam and Eve as parents not have shared those fundamental, life-transforming, world-transforming realities to their children? Of course they would have. Verse 3, as it unfolds for us here, tells us about a critical episode in human history. Certainly, Genesis 2 was a critical episode as sin enters into the picture and the fall of man occurs. But verse 3 is also a critical episode in human history. Because in verse 3, we discover that Cain decided to reject the training he had received, to reject the example that had been set for him, and come to God on his own terms. The implication, I think clearly here, is that up to that point, he had continued to follow the pattern. He had continued to act on the things that he had been taught. If he had not chosen to do that, in terms of coming to God with animal sacrifice, as Abel was in the passage that we read, if he had not done that previous to this point, there would have been the same outcome and consequences of God rejecting him and God not accepting the thing that he had brought. But because that had not occurred, we can assume it wasn't occurring. But now, at some point in time, for some reason, Cain became bold enough and determined enough that he stood up to his parents, to his brother, and to his culture in a way, and rejected what had been taught him and exampled for him, and decided to come to God another way. He demonstrated he didn't believe the message. He demonstrated it in the course of time. His response prefigures the reality of family life throughout all of history since. And that is that not all the children accept the truth that's communicated, even when it's demonstrated for them by the parent, and even when it's clearly taught to them by the parent. Those don't turn the child into a robot where there's no decision being made. A child has to make a decision, whether as a child or as an adult. They make a decision of will about the truth that they've been exposed to. Part of the grief of childbearing in this world that Genesis 3 was informing us as an outcome of the fall, is that people you love, children, do not choose to follow the God whom you love as well. And they reject the training and teaching. So how old was Cain when this decision, this critical episode occurred? And the Bible doesn't say. In the course of time, an indefinite point. But consider for a moment how the ages of some people when critical decisions were made. And in Abraham's case, as we go further into the book of Genesis, we discover that he was 75 when he decided to leave the idolatry of his father and follow the Lord. Moses was 40 when he made a decision to leave the idolatry of Egypt and choose to identify with the people of God. So my guess is that Cain was probably older than 20 years old, older than his early 20s when these events occurred. He was probably well established, married, as would have been Abel. Probably many other of Adam and Eve's children would have been alive at that point in time and perhaps married. In other words, there were more people around. There was a culture bigger than the four, Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel, when these events were occurring. Cain and Abel were not children in Genesis 4 events, even though sometimes I've seen Sunday school literature showing them as children. But listen, the implication here is this is not children. These are not decisions of little ones. Now, next time, we'll take a much closer look at the decisions that were made here, how Cain chose to approach God and how Abel did. But think for a moment, read the Bibles carefully, and see time gaps when they exist. God bless.